risk is ours.
Ow!
We've talked at length about the 1987 live-action He-Man film, but we've never discussed about the potential sequels that could have been. Well, let's remedy that, as in this video, we'll go over the potential sequels and why they never happened. Let's get to it.
I'll be back.
I know that the 1987 live-action He-Man movie doesn't have the best fan following, but Dolph Lundgren and Frank Langella did make for a compelling cast, and the story was intriguing enough. Moreover, when Frank Langella's Skeletor throws out that cheeky, ominous promise, "I'll be back," at the end of the film, it is a literal sequel hook. The movie ends with Skeletor seemingly destroyed, and then undercuts the victory with a quick sting that tells audiences, and more importantly, investors, that this was meant to be part 1. So what was supposed to happen next? What story did the filmmakers intend to tell, and what did the actual planned sequel script direction look like once Canon's money problems and Mattel's approvals got involved? There are two versions to this question, and one of them is the director, Gary Goddard's preferred sequel direction. He intended to go back to Eternia and finally build the world with real scale and mythic depth. Meanwhile, the sequel Canon started developing in practice was a cheaper follow-up that doubled down on Earth, with He-Man and Skeletor both hiding in modern life, including Skeletor returning as, or inside, a billionaire industrialist named Aaron Dark. In this video, I will break down both versions because they explain why that final line exists and why the sequel never happened. Before I begin the journey, let me take you back to how the movie really ended. In the film, Skeletor is defeated and falls into the pit beneath Castle Grayskull. Then the movie tags the ending with Skeletor surviving and declaring,
"I'll be back,"
which is basically a neon sign saying, "Sequel incoming." That line matters because Canon and Mattel were not treating this as a one-and-done fantasy movie. The entire project was built on the idea that He-Man was a brand engine, and if a movie could sell toys, then a sequel could do it too. Thus, a continuing film series would keep the whole franchise in public conversation. The irony is that the same forces that made "I'll be back" feel inevitable also poisoned the sequel's odds. Canon was sliding into financial chaos, and the first film's compromises from the budget limits, Earth setting, and smaller character roster shaped what a sequel could even be. Also, I think that in order to understand the sequel plans, you have to understand what Goddard and the team were dealing with on the first one. Goddard had explained that Mattel originally wanted a huge lineup, but the movie couldn't afford it. He framed it like an adventure structure problem, not just a money problem, and he pushed a smaller core group. His blunt summary was essentially, we can only afford to follow about 7 people. That one constraint ripples into everything. It helps explain why a sequel plan might lean into disguises and Earth settings again. If you cannot afford a packed Eternia, you either reduce the world or reframe the story. I also cannot look past a significant costume problem. He-Man in live action was a tightrope because Goddard's other big battle was making He-Man look like He-Man without turning it into an unintentional comedy. He has a memorable way of putting it. Making the costume exactly like the toy risks looking like, which is a grown, almost naked guy running around. This shows the tone they were chasing. Goddard wanted the movie to take the characters seriously, and that same instinct shows up in his description of the story approach. Goddard had directly tied the Earth-based plot to budget limitations, describing the script's approach as a fish-out-of-water story. Even if fans wanted pure Eternia, the production reality meant Earth was cheaper, controllable, and could be shot like a contemporary adventure with occasional fantasy set pieces. Goddard has said that if a sequel happened, he wanted to take the story to Eternia and develop it with the kind of depth you associate with epic fantasy worlds. He even compared the ambition to building Eternia with the depth of Middle-earth, while stressing Eternia's unique blend of magic and high tech. That is the version many fans assume the "I'll be back" line is pointing toward. In that imagined sequel, Skeletor survives and returns to rebuild his power base on Eternia. The heroes are pulled back into the real political and mythic conflict of their homeworld. The toy line's wider cast could be integrated more naturally, because Eternia is where those characters belong. I can totally understand Goddard's creative instinct, but it was not the sequel canon started moving toward. According to reporting summarized in Brian C. Baer's How He-Man Mastered the Universe, Trade Talk in early 1988 described canon's Masters of the Universe 2 in a way that would have shocked fans hoping for all Eternia all the time. The Los Angeles Times item Baer quotes is blunt about the premise. It describes the sequel taking He-Man to Earth disguised as a football quarterback. Yes, I know how this sounds, but such was the plan. The sequel was tied to director Albert Pyun, a filmmaker known for low-budget genre work. Baer describes a set budget around $4.5 million, dramatically smaller than the first film's ambitions. A smaller budget pushes you toward a different kind of movie that is less of a cosmic fantasy and more modern disguised thriller. But what was supposed to happen after I'll Be Back? Baer's account states that, working from Pyun's treatment, Stephen Tolkien fleshed out the screenplay, and that both Tolkien and Pyun later confirmed the basic concept. What was supposed to follow next was that Skeletor would survive his fall beneath Grayskull. He would somehow return to Earth and would be either disguised as or reincarnated in the form of billionaire industrialist Aaron Dark. Learning this, He-Man would have Gwildor teleport him back to Earth to stop him, and He-Man's own cover on Earth would be the whole football star angle. So the I'll Be Back promise was not necessarily about Skeletor returning in full skull-faced armor right away. The sequel concept suggests something sneakier. Skeletor comes back through infiltration, and he hides inside the systems of Earth, money, corporations, and influence. It is a very canon solution because when you cannot afford Eternia's armies, make the villain a CEO. It creates a thematic mirror. He-Man, the ultimate heroic icon, is reduced to blending in as a star athlete. Skeletor, the ultimate fantasy tyrant, is blending in as a billionaire. But it is exactly the kind of pitch that might terrify Mattel, because it moves further away from the toy shelf visuals. Maybe this is where the sequel ran into the wall. Baer also says it's not believed the scripts were finished, and that canon was not exactly famous for waiting on perfect scripts before moving forward. So we cannot honestly claim that a complete scene-by-scene final draft is publicly available. What we can do is build the most grounded outline possible from the confirmed basics above. I have a feeling that the film likely opens by paying off the tag. Skeletor survives beneath Castle Grayskull, but instead of marching back to the throne room, he escapes through the same kind of dimensional travel the first film used. That gets him to Earth, where the Aaron Dark identity becomes his new body or mask. If the story leans into reincarnation, it is a horror-adjacent idea. Skeletor's evil essence inhabits a powerful human shell. If it leans into disguise, it is more like an espionage fantasy. Now, I wouldn't say that the story is completely off or uninteresting, but it is surely not what we have known the He-Man universe to be like. Then, going by this narrative, I am guessing that He-Man learns Skeletor is back. Gwildor brings him to Earth to stop him. But the twist is that He-Man cannot just show up as a glowing barbarian prince in a harness. The premise says he takes a football star form or disguise, leaning into a Flash Gordon-style secret identity pulp. This implies a misdirection driven by investigation and escalation. He-Man tries to locate Aaron Dark, figure out what he is planning, and stop him before he opens a doorway back to Eternia or pulls Eternia's magic into Earth. But have you ever wondered why the decision was made to turn Skeletor into a billionaire industrialist? Well, the easy answer is probably that money is power. Infrastructure and technology have shaped heroes like Iron Man and Batman, or villains like Lex Luthor, and it can obviously work with Skeletor as well. Skeletor has always been a conqueror who weaponizes science fantasy tech. Earth's corporate world is a modern version of Snake Mountain's war machine, so the likely endgame is Aaron Dark using corporate resources to recreate, steal, or reverse engineer the kind of dimensional tech that lets Eternians travel in the first place. It becomes a race with time, as the question becomes, can He-Man stop the portal before Skeletor's return becomes a full invasion? But does this outline fill every blank? No. because the materials publicly discussed focus on the premise and the production collapse, not a full plot breakdown. But as an answer to what was supposed to happen after I'll Be Back, the Aaron Dark hook is the clearest, most specific payoff described by the people involved. One of the biggest, what might have been details, is that Dolph Lundgren was not locked in for the sequel. Bear reports talk that Lundgren had no interest in reprising the role, leading Pune's production to replace him with surfer and model Laird Hamilton, who fit the look and did not have Lundgren's accent. That matters for tone. A recast signals a reset. If Skeletor is now a human industrialist for most of the runtime, you also have casting flexibility on the villain side. So the sequel was more like a train already rolling down the track, not a perfectly assembled product. But certain factors contributed to the eventual cancellation of the film. For instance, Canon's financial problems caught up hard. A payment issue caused Marvel's Spider-Man rights situation to implode. The Mattel deal fell apart around the same time, with different explanations depending on who you ask. Goddard's claim is especially direct. Mattel saw the script, or perhaps the storyboards, and pulled the license. That quote is basically the death certificate. If Mattel pulled the license because the sequel drifted too far from the brand's core fantasy, then the Aaron Dark concept might have been the very thing that doomed it. I can understand that from a toy company's perspective, the safest sequel pitch is more Eternia, more recognizable characters, and more iconic looks. From a desperate studio's perspective, the safest sequel pitch is cheaper, faster, modern settings, and less creature work. Even though Masters 2 died, Canon had already sunk money into sets and costumes. So the studio did what a struggling studio does. It repurposed the resources. Bear describes how Pune and screenwriter Don Michael Paul drafted a new script in a frantic sprint, leading to Cyborg, 1989, which was shot fast and cheap, and turning a profit. This is why you sometimes see the phrase Masters of the Universe 2 Cyborg float around as an urban legend. Bear notes that newspaper listings sometimes even mislabeled Cyborg that way. Fans have speculated for years about what elements of Masters 2 survived in Cyborg. Bear mentions speculation like the cyborg being Faker or the protected young woman being an amnesiac She-Ra, but frames this as fan talk rather than confirmed story fact. Even outside the sequel specific, the quotes that survive from the main creative voices explain why the "I'll be back" stinger feels like a promise the movie itself cannot fulfill. Goddard's comments show a director trying to make a toy adaptation feel like a real fantasy adventure, while constantly boxing with budget and brand approvals. The whole 7 people limitation is the most honest snapshot of the production ceiling, and you can see the ambition in his longing for an Eternia-focused sequel with real depth. Langella's perspective is the reason Skeletor dominates the film's memory. In Vanity Fair's career timeline, he recalls taking the meeting with Goddard and thinking it was a terrible script, just awful, but still wanting to make Skeletor real and believable, and wanting his young son to see him as Skeletor. That line is crucial. If your main villain is being played like a serious stage character, you naturally want the ending to tease his return because the villain is the engine. This makes the sequel concept funnier in hindsight. If you boil it down to the most evidence-backed payoff to Skeletor's "I'll be back," it is that Skeletor survives the fall beneath Grayskull. He returns to Earth in a hidden identity, specifically described as being disguised or reincarnated as billionaire industrialist Aaron Dark. He-Man follows him back to Earth via Gwildor, and He-Man himself is disguised, with trade reporting describing him as a football quarterback. The sequel was moving forward under Albert Pune with a sharply reduced budget, with sets and costumes underway in North Carolina, until licensing and money failures killed it. I think that the most ironical thing is that Skeletor said he would be back, and in a strange meta-sense, he was. He came back as a legend of an unmade sequel. He came back as a shadow inside the production history of Cyborg. And if you want the most He-Man takeaway possible, it is this. Well, with everything said and done, I still feel that the '87 live-action attempt deserved a proper follow-up, and I wish a production house was worthy enough to handle it, with a big purse like the movie deserved. It is probably for the best that we never got a half-ass budget-constrained project to serve as a sequel. And I wouldn't mind if someone picked up the remains of the 87 memories and turned them into a gritty sequel after all these years. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the sequel possibilities, and also share your thoughts on the wasted opportunity down below.